So I'll start with, as I'm wont to do, I'll start with a joke, which strikes me as particularly apposite for the discussion of whether interculturalism and multiculturalism are different. The same thing. It was one of my father's favorite jokes. Son, this is during the Cold War. Some of you might remember we had a Cold War. For the younger people, turn to someone in your older age group and they'll explain. During the Cold War, a son asks his father, "Daddy, what's the difference between communism and capitalism?" And the father responds, "Capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, and communism is the opposite." So, well, I could say it again. It's very subtle. So when we think about interculturalism and multiculturalism, the two names may give the indication that there's something very different going on in Quebec and in the rest of Canada with respect to the basic models that are being thought about or in terms of in order to integrate immigrants. And I have defended the view over the past few years that the difference is much more one of emphasis than one of basic theoretical sort of structure. And I'd like to just rehearse that point again with you today. Now, I don't know who I'm speaking to exactly, so I don't know how much history is sort of acquired between is common ground between us, but I'll assume that it's okay to go over some stuff that may actually be well trodden ground for a lot of you, perhaps less for others. I think that in Quebec, there is a misperception which has become so ground in that it is now almost difficult. It's become reality, right? It is, it has displaced reality as the way of perceiving Canadian multiculturalism. The theory is that multiculturalism, a la English Canada, is essentially a theory of separation. It is a theory in which ethnic groups are invited, indeed encouraged, to, as it were, live separately from one another within the fabric of Canadian society, accepting only as common ground a very, very thin sort of set of common laws, but really nothing else. So it is a kind of a laissez-faire type policy, which leads to ghettoization. Right? And ghettoization perceived not as a sort of undesired result of a policy, but almost as a desired result. Multiculturalism really is, as the term would seem to indicate when you take it in a certain way, the persistence of completely discrete, separate cultures sharing essentially a territory and a very, very minimal set of common laws. Now, I think that a moment's sort of study of the reality of Canada reveals that something much more complex is going on. Now, one of the reasons why this sort of, I think, fiction of what Canadian multiculturalism is has been so prevalent has to do with the history of multiculturalism, or at least the history of multiculturalism as it's been perceived here in Quebec. Now, rightly or wrongly, I'm not a historian, so I will sort of defer to people with more historical knowledge to know that this is sort of like a almost true, vaguely true, not true at all representation of facts. But again, the historical representation that is dominant here is that multiculturalism was construed when it was at its inception in 1971 by the Trudeau government and subsequently developed with the Multiculturalism Act in 1988 under the Mulroney government as a set of policies, the basic function of which had actually not that much to do with immigrants, but more to do with the trivialization of Quebec's own particular kind of distinctiveness within the Canadian Federation. So it was, in a way of saying to Quebecers, well, you're distinct, sure, everybody's distinct. You're distinct, I'm distinct, everybody's distinct. We all come from these distinct places, and we celebrate our various distinctions, our various, cultures, regardless of exactly how they came about, be it through, we have various cultures on Canadian soil, and we celebrate that diversity, and we don't make hierarchies amongst the different kinds of diversity that are present on the territory. So this is a way of trivializing Quebec's distinctiveness, as it were, within the Federation, and undercutting, as it were, the sovereignist project. Now, again, I'm not making any claims about whether this is a true or a false representation of Trudeau's intentions. What I want to, very often, even when politicians have certain intentions with respect to the policies that they put forward, the policies actually escape their voluntary grasp. They become something different from what their designers had originally planned. I think if you look at 40 some odd years of multiculturalism as theory and as practice in Canada, it has become something quite different. It has become indeed a variety of things which pull in a variety of different directions, But it is certainly, amongst other things, been functioning alongside things like the Charter and the notion of Charter patriotism that has emerged as a result of the Charter in 1982 as a policy of integration, as an element within a policy of integration. An element within a policy of integration which basically is premised on the following assumption. The assumption is this: integration goes better rather than worse. Integration goes better rather than worse when immigrants are allowed and even encouraged and perhaps even given certain material resources with which to retain certain aspects of their patrimonial cultures while they do the work of integration, right? So it is a way of facilitating over maybe a couple of generations the work of integration, which is not being put aside by multiculturalism, but indeed being promoted and encouraged by multiculturalism as a way of easing the cultural shock that comes from the attempt to integrate when one is coming from places that are often quite culturally distinct from the receiving society. So this is, I think, regardless of what was going on in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's head in 1970 or 1971 when he dreamed up the policy or the idea of multiculturalism, this is the way I think that multiculturalism has largely functioned in Canada. Now, I'm going to put a bémol, as we say. Je vais introduire une bémol. Peut-être que je vais même introduire du français à ce stade-ci, comme pour prendre l'invitation de Jack. J'ai dit à un moment que le multiculturalisme comme pratique est allé dans plein de sens différents au terme, donc, après avoir été institué par des gouvernements successifs à Ottawa. Il me semble que si on veut... la manifestation du multiculturalisme qui est allée le plus dans le sens de la caricature qui est présente au Québec, de ce que j'ai présenté comme étant la caricature qui est présente au Québec, a probablement été le résultat de la voie juridique. Vous le savez comme moi, la Charte canadienne, la Constitution canadienne, contient une clause qui invite les juges de la Cour suprême, une clause interprétative, 25, je crois, 27? I was close. Yeah. What's 25? I don't know. Okay. Now you asked me tough. Okay. 27, qui invite les juges à interpréter les articles de la Charte dans une optique qui favorise et qui fait la promotion du fait et de la valeur du multiculturalisme au Canada. Je ne veux pas rentrer, parce que je n'ai pas le temps de le faire, dans toutes les décisions dans lesquelles cet article a été invoqué, mais il me semble qu'il a infléchi certaines décisions de la Cour suprême dans les 20-25 dernières années, dans un sens qui correspond peut-être un peu à la caricature que le Québec donne des politiques du multiculturalisme, c'est-à-dire à mener à ce qu'on encourage la distinction, la séparation entre les communautés, la capacité que certaines communautés ont à vivre en fonction de règles, de normes différentes de celles de la majorité. Mais ce qui est très important et ce qui est très intéressant à noter, c'est que, disons, le versant juridique du multiculturalisme qui a été donc promu à travers une interprétation de l'article 27 ne diffère pas beaucoup de ce qui s'est en fait passé également au Québec à travers l'interprétation par les instances juridiques pertinentes au Québec de la Charte québécoise. Donc, si on regarde les décisions qui ont été prises par la Commission des droits de la personne et de la jeunesse d'un côté et les décisions qui ont été prises par la Cour suprême du Canada et par des instances inférieures, à la lumière de l'article 27, on ne voit pas vraiment, je crois, une différence substantielle sur le plan théorique dans les manières que ces instances ont perçu la responsabilité de la société d'accueil d'infléchir, de modifier l'application des lois en réponse à la diversité qui est présente sur le territoire canadien et québécois. Donc, je ferme cette parenthèse et je voudrais maintenant donc exprimer aussi clairement que je le peux ce que je vois comme étant, j'ai dit il y a un instant, qu'il y a une hypothèse qui gouverne la théorie et la pratique aussi bien de l'interculturalisme que du multiculturalisme au Canada et au Québec. Je vais le répéter en français, ce que j'ai dit déjà en anglais. Le travail de l'intégration se fait mieux. Hein, lorsqu'on permet, et même lorsqu'on encourage des immigrants, de maintenir pendant un certain temps certains aspects de leur culture patrimoniale, plutôt que d'exiger une assimilation. Hein. L'assimilation crée un choc qui est difficile et qui peut créer des contre-coups. Et je pense que si on regarde certains pays comme la France qui ont un modèle du moins théoriquement assimilateur, je dis bien théoriquement parce que dans la pratique, les choses sont toujours beaucoup plus compliquées, on voit que certains de ces contre-coups sont réels. Hein. Il y a des chocs qui viennent de la demande sociale et institutionnelle pour non seulement une intégration, mais une assimilation culturelle à relativement court terme que le Canada et le Québec ont voulu éviter. Et je crois en grande mesure, ça a été à leur avantage de mettre de l'avant des politiques qui exigent l'intégration des immigrants, mais qui ne voient pas l'intégration et l'assimilation comme étant synonymes. So, I think that what we have, therefore, is a continuum where we have two models which Canadians and Quebecers have both wanted to avoid. On the one hand, you have the extreme that is represented perhaps by the rhetoric of French institutions, which is the rhetoric of assimilation. You come here and you shed your patrimonial cultural allegiances and you become, well, not even a Frenchman, you become a citizen, a pure citizen, shorn of all particular cultural attachments, which is, of course, a fiction that is very difficult to realize in practice, and the attempt to realize it has all kinds of weird effects, which I think French society is still very much dealing with. And if you look at the presidential campaign these days in France, yeah, you see the impact of that model and its strange sort of boomerang effects. And we're not here to talk about France. At the other extreme of the spectrum is the caricature that is held here in Quebec about Canadian multiculturalism. In other words, you have the caricature of laissez-faire, the idea that essentially a receiving society is literally just a vessel, right, to be filled in culturally and even in some respects legally by successive waves of immigration as they arrive. So the other extreme is one in which the receiving society places absolutely or at least very little requirements on immigrants as a condition of the achievement of the status of full citizenship, integration light, let's say, or laissez-faire. So I think that if you look at interculturalism, multiculturalism, if you look at the practice, but even to some degree the theoretical sort of pronouncements that have been made, I think Gérard Bouchard probably is at this point the main sort of theoretical exponent of the intercultural model, what you'll find is two models that lie between these two extremes. Two models that lie between these two extremes, and where they fall, right, is, I think, slightly different in Quebec and in the rest of Canada. But that difference, I think, is accounted for largely by factual rather than theoretical considerations. And perhaps I'll end, I don't know how long I've been talking. Good. Yeah. Perhaps I'll end by just giving my sense of what those factual, empirical considerations are that account for Quebec and Canada falling at slightly different points on that continuum. One just is, and here I'm not saying anything particularly original, not that anything I've said until now has been particularly original. One is quite obviously the issue of language, right? Linguistic integration, linguistic convergence is all obviously a very big part of cultural integration, and I think one of the differences in emphases between what happens here in Quebec and what happens in the rest of Canada is that, as it were, English Canadians get for free what Quebecers have to work for. To put it slightly more theoretically, the centripetal force of English in North America and increasingly in the world makes it the case that one does not have to enact particularly vigorous policies in a country like Canada in order to ensure, make it likely that over a generation, immigrants will acquire the language of the majority. There's a linguist who once said something that I like repeating. It's a lovely phrase. English isn't something you learn, it's something you catch. Right? In the world today, it's like it's everywhere. It's on the internet. It doesn't require. It is the language of art, commerce, science, etc. It doesn't require any great sort of coercive policy mechanism in order to ensure that over a generation, immigrants will learn English, certainly in North America. Now, French, obviously, the situation is very different. French is a global language. It is spoken around the world, but in the context of North America, it is very much a small language. And the acquisition of French cannot be taken for granted, as we know very well from our own history here in Quebec. And it has to be, therefore, the result of more deliberate, voluntarist linguistic policies of the kind which we have been debating, implementing, and debating the limits of in Quebec for the better part of the last 40 years or so. So first difference just has to do with the centripetal force exercised by English in the context of North America and certainly of the world versus the more fragile condition in which French finds itself as a linguistic pole of attraction in the absence of moderately coercive policies like the ones that we have in Quebec's language charter. And the second, so the idea here is basically that you have these two extremes. Interculturalism, multiculturalism fall between the two extremes. What accounts for the differences is more a question of fact than a question of high theory. The first fact has to do with the very different situations of the two languages, English and French, the logics that dominate the acquisition of one language rather than another. And the second fact has to do with the very different demographics of Quebec and the rest of Canada. Now, again, this is Historical Trivialities 101. As you know, this society had a rather high birth rate for at least a couple of centuries, leading up to 1950s, 1960s, when birth rates dropped off precipitously. If you look at the continued impact of, say, the Anglo-Celtic sort of founding people in the rest of Canada versus the weight of the sort of original colonists in Quebec, you'll find that there's a great asymmetry. There are just far more people in Quebec, a far greater proportion of people who can trace their roots back to almost all the way back to the founding of this society relative to the proportion of nominally English Canadians who trace their roots back that far in English Canadian history. I think the effect of that is a certain quite understandable demand, one that is very difficult to implement through policy. It is more at the level of sort of aspiration than something that is really implementable. For cultural integration to take on a slightly thicker form in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. The shared history of English Canadians in a place like Toronto is actually extremely thin at this point, right? People come from all over the place, and aside from linguistic convergence, which is obviously a requirement, the requirements that it is even plausible to impose upon immigrants in terms of thicker cultural convergence are difficult. Are quite difficult to identify. Nothing to do with religion anymore, or even with religion understood in a kind of a patrimonial or cultural way. Maybe something to do with the Maple Leafs. I'm not sure. That was another joke. I think that there's a cultural expectation in Quebec, born perhaps in some measure of the continued demographic weight, much greater weight of the sort of quote-unquote founding people, and therefore of the continued persistence of the sort of historical narrative that, la survivance, etc., that creates a requirement or an expectation, a wish perhaps, that cultural integration occur perhaps at a thicker level than is the case in English Canada, that it take on more dimensions than merely language. Now, there's a kind of a poignancy about this requirement because it's difficult to see exactly how to implement it through policy. I get the sense, and here I'm going to speak quite subjectively on the basis of my discussions with people who hold this view rather than any sort of deep analysis of policy. There is a kind of sense on the one hand that it would be nice were immigrants to sort of somehow, in some magical way, share a sense of the history of this place, even though it is not their history, and view themselves as somehow woven in to the historical narrative of the founding people to a greater degree than they actually are. At the same time, a realization that this sort of thing is one that is very difficult to achieve through policy. Right? Public policy has limits. There are certain things that we can achieve and other things that we can't achieve through public policy. We can get at people's actions. We can't get at their hearts, as it were, to use a sort of facile distinction. And I think that tension is one that it therefore also explains the difference, not so much in policy, because as I said, it's very difficult to change the way in which people view their link to the historical narrative of Quebec through policy, but it changes something about the expectations that we have here in Quebec. And I don't think it's something that can be just balayé du revers de la main. It's something that is quite natural, given the very distinctive history of this place. But again, very important to, I think, and really I'll end with this, I think that there's a temptation these days in Quebec, je veux le dire en français peut-être, il y a peut-être une tentation au Québec ces temps-ci, en vertu de ce que j'ai dit jusqu'à maintenant, de vouloir jeter le bébé avec l'eau du bain. Jusqu'à maintenant, il y a eu un débat entre interculturalistes et multiculturalistes. Je crois qu'il y a une pression de plus en plus forte pour rejeter même le modèle interculturaliste comme étant trop timide dans sa promotion du caractère distinct de la société québécoise, de l'affirmation des racines historiques des Québécois. Je pense qu'il y a un mouvement néo-traditionnaliste très fort, articulé autour des écrits de gens comme Jacques Beauchemin, Mathieu Bock-Côté, Éric Bédard et d'autres, un courant, disons, néo-conservateur, avec un petit c, là, qui n'a aucun lien nécessairement avec une idéologie purement politique, qui lui dit, vous savez quoi, l'interculturalisme et le multiculturalisme, c'est aussi mauvais pour le Québec, l'un comme l'autre. Il faut revenir à un modèle, alors là, peut-être plus carrément assimilateur, ou bien un modèle qui remet en question la capacité que nous avons en tant que société pour intégrer de manière efficace des immigrants qui ne sont pas culturellement compatibles avec le courant culturel dominant au Québec. Et nous devons donc rejeter les deux modèles. Je crois que ce serait une erreur assez grave. Je crois que de manière générale, cet entre-deux que j'ai tenté de définir, hein, qui caractérise autant le multiculturalisme que l'interculturalisme et qui consiste à penser quelque chose qui, à mon avis, est fondamentalement vrai, à savoir que l'intégration d'une société se fait mieux quand les immigrants ont la possibilité de maintenir certains aspects de leur culture patrimoniale, que de rejeter cette idée servirait mal les intérêts du Québec. Mais je vois des pressions assez fortes venant de plusieurs directions pour aller dans le sens, alors là, non plus du multiculturalisme, mais pas de l'interculturalisme non plus, mais vers un modèle beaucoup plus assimilateur qui, je crois, enfin, je me répète, nous desservirait. Je m'arrêterai là. Merci.